I want to pose a challenge to you,
Sure.
in the spirit of this, which is that, and I was taught, our mutual friends Brett and Heather came on the show, and we had a moment about faith. I brought up that I've become increasingly, attached and interested in my Catholic heritage and the Catholic sort of belief system. And I'm not claiming to be an expert. I'm not Bishop Barron. Like, I basically like turned to him and his YouTube channel to learn about this stuff. But one of the things that seems to be true is that the courage to stand up for these principles, the underlying rationale for, I think, what some of these principles rely on, which is a basic level of equal dignity. It's not perfect human equality, but a basic level of shared dignity that is equal. That these things are an inheritance of essentially the faith tradition, and I'll just say the Christian faith tradition, and roll the sort of Jewish underpinnings of that into that. I'm not saying that Islam doesn't have any of that. I don't know enough about Islam, and I'm not prepared to be some anti-Islam guy just because I don't know enough about it. But I'll just speak to this. Richard Dawkins recently said that he, and this has been floating around on Twitter like recently, that he's culturally Christian, which is kind of an amazing thing for Richard Dawkins to say. And it just strikes me that we are at a moment where the hope of the new atheists has of some kind of move towards a kind of like a pure rationalism seems like a failed enterprise. And that we've gotten instead is a void filled by new fake religions whose metaphysics are at odds with reality in ways that, frankly, the Christian faith is not at odds with reality, because it basically says, look, there's this other plane, and it's not at odds with reality. It doesn't, you can't prove it in the ways that would be scientific, and that, I imagine for you, that's enough to be like, well, why do I want to believe that nonsense? But it's not at odds with reality. And so I'd rather have a religion whose norms and whose presuppositions support civilization, support human dignity, than remove that and let some cancerous growth come in that's at direct odds with reality and is trying to rip it apart from the seams. And I'm sorry to like kind of go off on a tangent here, but do you feel that? Has that, I know you've written about trying to write persuasively on behalf of atheism. Has that been an area where you've been like, maybe that's not strategically sound, and by virtue of that, maybe wrong?
Boy, there's so much there. First of all, I want to take the Richard. So Dawkins has said that before, that he's culturally Christian, but it just happens to be going around now. I believe he writes about that in The God Delusion as well. So that's not a new thing. The dignity piece is very interesting. The people who are in the camp of critical social justice, they both believe broadly in dignity, but they believe in an equity-based dignity. In other words, we need to, people who have historical oppression markers, for example, through race, they should be afforded more dignity than people who do not have those historical oppression markers. In fact, we can even give them dignity at the expense of the people who have traditionally and historically been on the top of that social pyramid. Okay. Now,
it's a zero-sum formulation of dignity in some respects.
That's correct. In fact, it's even worse than that in some sense, but basically you can distill it down to that. Okay. So what you just asked is what I call the substitution hypothesis. And I interviewed Richard about this. I've interviewed many, many people about this. The substitution hypothesis is the idea, I think it's best explained through Game of Thrones. Have you seen Game of Thrones?
Yeah.
Okay, good. You're not dead to me. So that as old religions decrease, belief in old religions decrease, belief in new religions increases. So the substitution hypothesis is, is there a necessary connection between a decrease in one religion and an increase in another? In other words, is belief the default? Is belief the default? If belief is the default, then wouldn't it be better to keep extant structures that we know more or less yield human flourishing, like Christianity, certainly certain benign forms of Christianity? Wouldn't that be better than rolling the dice and risking it with wokeism or critical social justice? So I think atheism in one sense was the canary in the coal mine. The amazing thing about the atheist movement was that the atheists, especially the atheists who were active atheists, went to conferences, etc., they themselves became religious. So there was a religion that arose within atheism. And it wasn't a Christianity, but it was a critical social justice. In fact, most of those atheist conferences, etc., they don't even talk about the existence for God. In fact, it's not even mentioned. What is mentioned is identity markers, the lack of women at conferences.
Really?
Oh yeah, this has been going on for years. They hunted out my buddy Dave Silverman. That's another story. But the atheist movement itself is religious. To the extent that the atheist movement.
Early in my, it's 2024, 15 years ago, roughly. On my bus routes into Manhattan every day, I watched a 20-hour symposium called Beyond Belief that I found on the internet. And it was Dawkins and Sam Harris and it was like the leading lights of the new atheist movement in this conference that was filmed. And then and then I went on a little tear reading all the intelligent design books. So I was having all kinds of fun. So you're saying now that kind of Beyond Belief conference is just critical social justice?
All of it,
fest.
yeah. I mean, I haven't looked in the last couple of years, but for sure, the canary in the coal mine was skepticism, and then it went to atheism. But my point to you is that that's the substitution hypothesis. The substitution hypothesis is, as belief in Christianity has decreased, is wokeism something that it didn't have to necessarily be wokeism, but did something else have to fill that void? And if so, then shouldn't we nudge people toward more benign forms of delusion? Some guy rose from a tomb, and he did that for your salvation, and he loves you, and he's watching you, and he cares about you. Wouldn't that be better than teaching people that the whole system is oppressive and racist and needs to be ripped to the ground? Well, yeah. I mean, obviously.
What's your answer?
So I'm not making the moral argument that we ought to nudge people into delusion, but I am saying that it clearly is true that certain forms of delusion are more harmful than others.
Do you feel like that substitution is not just not that we just have one example, but that does where do you stand on the belief spectrum here of that? Like, do you think that that's right?
Yeah, I asked Richard about that, and he said he doesn't think it's true because, he hopes it isn't, and he doesn't think it is. He said if it's true, his whole life's work can be thrown out. So I don't know whether or not the substitution hypothesis is true. I mean, if you look at Phil Zuckerman has some interesting work on this. If you look at the rates of belief in Scandinavia, for example, they're very small, God beliefs. Not many. Almost, all the churches and cathedrals, et cetera, have been abandoned. But they believe in other things. Like Iceland, they believe in fairies and gnomes and pixies and garden sprites and all this stuff. So I don't know if the substitution hypothesis is true or not. But the question is, does that cause me to reflect on my work within atheism? The answer to that would be yes and no. Clearly, wokeism has been an unmitigated catastrophe for society at multiple levels, divisive, toxic. I don't know if I'd say ruinous because the jury's still out on that. So it both has and has not caused me to do that. I think that what's most important to think about is what is true. And I would not nudge people toward more benign delusions, but what I would do is I would be more likely to question people and ask them if I thought their beliefs were more detrimental or dangerous or harmful to themselves or society.
If you like this clip, you should check out the full video and all the other great content we've got at Dad Saves America. So be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and ring that bell so you won't miss our new stuff as it drops each week.